No one stood beside the CEO after the accident. No one, except the black single dad she had fired only the week before. The hospital hallway had never felt so quiet. The woman who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing now lay broken in a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, hooked to machines that beeped in the dark. And the chairs outside her door sat empty. Every single one of them. The executives who used to fight for a seat at her table had vanished. The friends who had toasted champagne to her success suddenly stopped answering their phones. Even the family members who once bragged about being related to her found 100 quiet excuses to stay away. The flowers kept arriving, expensive, wrapped in ribbon, signed by assistants. But the people never did. Then, just as the last of the evening sun bled out through the window blinds, the door creaked open. And standing there, holding nothing but a plain brown paper bag, was the one person nobody in that hallway ever expected to see. The single father she had fired, in front of the entire company, only 7 days earlier. A nurse froze mid-step. A passing doctor slowed down. For a moment, the whole floor seemed to hold its breath, because the man in that doorway had every reason on earth to be anywhere else, and yet there he was. If a story about kindness, about second chances, about the people who show up when no one else will has ever meant something to you, then stay with me until the very end, because what this man does next is the kind of thing that quietly restores your faith in people. Before we go any further, I want you to know something. This channel is brand new, and every single subscribe is what keeps stories like this one alive. It costs you nothing, it takes 1 second, and it means more to us than you could ever know. So go ahead, tap that subscribe button, tell us down in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and let's get into it. Her name was Emma Carter, and for 15 years, that name meant power. She had taken a struggling little startup with 9 employees and turned it into Carter Global, one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. The business magazines put her on their covers. They called her brilliant. They called her relentless. And behind her back, in the hallways of her own building, they called her something else entirely. The Iron CEO. The woman who never let emotion touch a business decision. Not once. Every meeting started on time, down to the second. Every deadline was sacred. Every mistake carried a price, and everyone paid it. Emma believed that greatness demanded sacrifice, that softness was just weakness wearing a nicer coat, and she expected every person who walked through her doors to believe the exact same thing. Investors loved her for it. Her people were terrified of disappointing her. And somewhere on the 4th floor of that gleaming glass building worked a man named Marcus Bennett. Marcus was quiet. The kind of quiet that people mistake for shyness until they realize it's actually strength. The strength of a man carrying more than anyone knows. He was raising his 8-year-old daughter, Amara, alone. Alone. Because 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife, Grace, to an illness that took her far too fast and far too young. One day she was there, singing in the kitchen, and the next she was a name on a hospital chart, and then she was a photograph on the mantel that Amara kissed goodnight every single evening. After Grace passed, something in Marcus quietly decided that his little girl would never feel the hole her mother left behind, not if he could help it. So every morning, long before the sun came up, Marcus was already awake. He made Amara's breakfast, pancakes on the good days, cereal on the tired ones. He packed her lunch with a little note tucked inside, because Grace used to do that, and he wasn't about to let the tradition die with her. He braided her hair, checked her backpack, walked her to the school gate, and only then did he climb into his beat-up sedan and race across the city to make it to his desk on time. And every night, every single night, after Amara was finally asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a small leather journal that Grace had given him on their last anniversary. And he wrote a letter to her. To his wife. He told her about Amara's day, about the drawing she made, about the tooth she lost, about the way she laughed. He filled page after page, letter after letter, keeping a running record of a life his wife would never get to see, so that one day, when Amara was grown, she could read them and know exactly how loved she had been. He didn't tell anyone about the journal. It was the most private thing he owned. At the office, Marcus was the man everyone leaned on. He stayed late without being asked. He covered for coworkers when their kids got sick, because he understood better than anyone what that felt like. He mentored the new hires nobody else had time for. He never complained, never asked for credit, never once told anyone how heavy his life had gotten. Because Marcus had a rule, one he lived by like scripture: my problems are mine to carry. They should never become someone else's burden. But life had started pressing down on him harder than ever. Because a few months back, little Amara had started getting sick. Not the ordinary kind of sick, the kind that meant doctors and specialists and words that no father ever wants to hear about his 8-year-old. She needed a procedure, an expensive one, the kind that only Marcus's company health insurance made even remotely possible. So he did the math the way exhausted parents do at 2 a.m, and he realized something that made his stomach drop. If he ever lost this job, he wouldn't just lose a paycheck. He'd lose the insurance. And if he lost the insurance, he'd lose the only door left standing between his daughter and the thing that could save her. So Marcus held on. He worked harder. He slept less. There were nights he got 3 hours, maybe 4. He picked up every extra assignment he could, kept his head down, and prayed to a God he wasn't sure was listening that he could just hold everything together a little while longer. There were nights, though, when the weight of it all nearly broke him. Nights when the bills were spread across the kitchen table like a losing hand of cards. When Amara's medicine cost more than his grocery budget for the week. When he'd sit in the dark long after she was asleep and let himself feel, just for a minute, exactly how tired he was. And in those moments he'd open Grace's journal, and he'd write to her, and it was almost like she was still there, sitting across the table, telling him what she always used to tell him. You're doing fine, Marcus. You're doing better than fine. Just keep showing up for her. That's all being a dad is. You just keep showing up. And so he did. Every day. No matter what. There was one other person in that building who saw all of it. His name was Ray, the night security guard, a big, slow-moving older man who worked the graveyard shift at the front desk. Ray saw Marcus come in early, saw him leave late, saw the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking, and saw the photograph of a little girl taped inside his employee badge. Ray never said much, but every night, as Marcus finally headed for the parking garage, Ray would look up and say the same 4 words, "Go home to her," and Marcus would nod and go. Ray remembered all of it, every bit of it. That's going to matter later. Hold on to that. Then came the Monday that changed everything. Emma had scheduled the single most important presentation of the entire fiscal year. Investors were flying in from 4 different states. The board would be watching. And because Emma wanted the whole company to feel the weight of the moment, she'd ordered the entire thing broadcast on the internal company live stream. Every department, every employee, every screen in the building tuned in to watch. Hundreds of eyes. It had to be flawless. Anything less was unacceptable. And the financial analysis, the beating heart of that whole presentation. The numbers that would either land the investors or lose them, that had been built, checked, and perfected by one person. Marcus Bennett. He'd stayed up half the night finishing it. It was good. It was better than good. He knew it, and quietly, for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel a small flicker of pride. This was going to be his moment. Maybe, just maybe, this was the thing that finally got him noticed. But that morning, just as he was grabbing his keys to leave, he heard a sound from Amara's room that no parent ever forgets. A thud. He ran. And he found his little girl on the floor, burning up with a fever so high her small body was shaking, her eyes half rolled back, unable to answer when he screamed her name. In that instant, the presentation, the investors, the job, the whole world, all of it disappeared. There was only Amara. He scooped her up, still in her pajamas, and drove to the emergency room faster than he'd ever driven in his life, one hand on the wheel and one hand reaching back to hold her tiny fingers. He carried her through the sliding doors, shouting for help. And then he did the only thing a father can do. He waited. He stood at the foot of a hospital bed and held her hand and refused to leave until a doctor finally looked him in the eye and said the words he needed to hear, "She's stable. She's going to be okay." Only then, with his hands still shaking and his shirt soaked in cold sweat, did Marcus remember. The presentation. It had started over an hour ago. He kissed Amara's forehead, whispered that he'd be right back, asked the nurse to watch her, and drove straight to the office, knowing he was late, but praying that when he explained why, it would be all right. Because surely a person could understand a father racing to save his dying child. He walked into that conference room nearly an hour late, still in yesterday's clothes. Exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and Emma Carter saw him. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't ask if something had happened. She didn't ask a single question. In front of the executives, in front of the investors, in front of hundreds of employees watching live on their screens across the entire building, she set down her papers, looked at him with those cold, unreadable eyes, and said that Carter Global had no room for people who put excuses before responsibility. That professionalism was the price of a seat in this building, and that clearly Marcus Bennett could no longer afford it. And then, in front of all of them, she fired him. On the spot. The room went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum. A dozen people wanted to say something, to stand up, to shout that Marcus was the most decent man in the entire company, that there had to be a reason, that this was wrong. But fear is a powerful thing in a room ruled by the Iron CEO. So no one moved. No one said a word. And Marcus? He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't tell her about the fever, or the hospital, or the little girl whose hand he'd been holding an hour ago. Because some part of him had already learned that this woman didn't want to hear it, and another part of him refused to lay his daughter's illness on the floor of that room to be picked apart by strangers. So, he simply lowered his head, turned around, and walked back to his desk. He put his few belongings into a small cardboard box, a coffee mug, a framed photo of Amara, a little stack of drawings she'd made him, and as he lifted the box, one of those drawings slipped loose and fluttered to the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was a sunflower, a big, bright, wobbly yellow sunflower that Amara had drawn for him, with the words "My dad is the best" written across the top in the careful, crooked handwriting of an 8-year-old. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it gently, slid it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, and carried his box out the door. On his way out, he passed Ray, who had come in early and heard the whole thing. Ray started to say something, but Marcus just shook his head, a sad little smile on his face, and said the only thing he could think to say. "They can take the job, Ray. They can't take being her dad." And Ray watched him go, and something in that big man's chest cracked a little. Marcus stepped outside into the cold morning light. He looked up one last time at the Carter Global logo shining on the front of the building, the place he'd given years of early mornings and late nights to. Then he got in his car and drove back to the hospital, back to a little girl who was waiting for him with tired eyes and a hopeful smile, who reached out her small arms the moment she saw him and said, "Daddy, you came back." "Always," he told her. Always, Emma Carter went back to her office that afternoon, believing she had protected the standards of her company. She felt nothing. She'd made harder calls than that before breakfast. She had absolutely no idea, none, that within 7 short days, her own life would be flipped completely upside down. And that the only person left standing at her side would be the very man she had just thrown away. 7 days. Remember that number. Because everything is about to change. Now here's something Emma never saw coming. That company live stream, the one she'd been so proud of, the one broadcasting her power to every screen in the building. Someone in that room had been quietly recording it on their phone. And that night, a 30-second clip appeared online. Just 30 seconds. A billionaire CEO, cold as winter, firing an exhausted man in front of a silent room while he stood there and took it without a word. By morning, that clip had 2 million views. By the end of the day, it had 10. The internet had a name for Emma now, and it wasn't Iron CEO. People were furious. They didn't know Marcus's name yet, but they knew his face, and they knew what they'd watched, and they wanted answers. And here's the part that tells you exactly who Marcus Bennett is. Within 48 hours, the messages started pouring in. Reporters wanted the story. Talk shows wanted him on the couch. A few brands and a couple of those big outrage farming accounts online offered him actual money. Real, life-changing money for a man in his situation. Just to come forward, name the company, tell the world how cruel Emma Carter really was, and let them turn his worst day into content. Marcus sat at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at those offers on his cracked phone screen. He thought about the insurance he'd lost. He thought about Amara's procedure and the bills stacking up on the counter. He thought about how easy it would be. One interview. One post. He could pay for everything. All he had to do was let them destroy her. And then he opened his journal, and he wrote a letter to Grace, like he did every night. And in it he wrote this. I'm going to read it to you the way he wrote it. Grace, they're offering me money to tell the world what she did. Enough to fix everything. And God knows I need it. But if I do it, Amara grows up knowing her daddy paid for her medicine by burning down another human being when they were already down. I can't teach her to be kind by being cruel. I won't. We'll figure it out another way. We always do. And he closed the journal, and he deleted every single message. Every one. He turned down the money, because being a good man to Marcus was worth more than being a rich one. Instead, he did what desperate, decent fathers do. He found work. Any work. He picked up shifts delivering groceries across the city during the day, up and down apartment stairs, in the rain, in the heat, dozens of orders a shift for tips and gas money. And at night, after Amara was asleep and a neighbor was watching her, he cleaned office buildings downtown. Mopping floors, emptying trash cans, wiping down desks in the very same skyline of glass towers where he used to have a desk of his own. He was proud, and he was tired, and he never once let his daughter see how scared he really was. There was one night, though, that stayed with him. He'd come home past midnight, his back aching, his hands raw from cleaning, and he'd found Amara awake, waiting up for him in the dark despite 100 bedtimes. She'd climbed into his lap and asked him a question that only a child would think to ask. "Daddy, aren't you mad at the lady who made you leave your job?" And Marcus had sat there for a long moment, holding his little girl, and he'd thought about how to answer her honestly. "You know what, baby?" he finally said. "Being mad is heavy. It's like carrying a backpack full of rocks everywhere you go. And I've got enough to carry already. I've got you." He kissed the top of her head. "So no, I'm not going to carry that too. Mad never fixed anybody's life. But being good to people, even the ones who weren't good to you, that's the only thing I ever saw actually change anything." Amara had thought about that very seriously, the way she thought about everything, and then she'd nodded and fallen asleep in his arms. He carried her to bed, and then he sat down and wrote it all in Grace's journal, so that one day their daughter would remember she'd heard it from her father first. If this story already has its hooks in you, do me a quick favor. Take 1 second right now, tap that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell us down in the comments how many letters you think Marcus has written to Grace in that little journal by now. There is so much more story waiting for you here on Dad Untold Chronicles, and trust me, you do not want to miss where this goes. Now, remember that number. 7 days. 7 days after Marcus walked out of Carter Global for the last time, Emma Carter was in the back of her black luxury sedan, riding home from another late board meeting. It was pouring. The kind of rain that turns a highway into a blur of red taillights and swimming headlights, where the world shrinks down to a few feet of wet asphalt in front of you. She was on her phone, of course, answering emails, the way she always was, missing the world going by outside her window, the way she always did. She never saw the truck. Up ahead, on a sharp curve slick with rain, a freight truck lost its grip on the road. Its trailer swung wide, jackknifing across 2 lanes, and there was nowhere for Emma's driver to go. The sound came first, the scream of tires, then the sickening crunch of metal folding into metal. Glass exploded across the highway like a burst of ice. Emma's car spun once, twice, and slammed into a concrete barrier with a force that folded the passenger side inward and knocked her instantly unconscious. For long minutes, in the pouring rain, she lay trapped in the wreckage while sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, growing closer. Emergency crews had to cut her out of what was left of the car. They pulled her free, loaded her into an ambulance, and raced her through the storm to the nearest hospital. The very same hospital, though nobody knew it yet, where a little girl named Amara had been fighting her own quiet battle. The news moved fast. Faster than the ambulance. Billionaire CEO in critical condition. It was on every business channel within the hour. Employees flooded social media with hearts and prayers and thoughts. Reporters camped outside the hospital doors. Flowers began arriving by the armful, and cameras filmed every bouquet, and for 1 full day. It looked like the whole world was standing vigil for Emma Carter. But then the cameras packed up. The story got old. A different headline took over. And that's when Emma learned the truth about the life she'd built. She woke up 2 days later. 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm held together with pins, cuts and bruises, and a road of recovery ahead of her that doctors measured in months, not weeks. And as the fog lifted and the pain settled in, Emma did what any person would do. She looked toward the door and she waited for the people she loved to come walking through it. They didn't. That first morning, she waited for her executives, the men and women who'd sworn loyalty in 100 meetings, who owed their careers to her. Instead, a nurse brought in another towering flower arrangement with a printed card. Get well soon. The leadership team. Not one of them came. She waited for the board members who called her a visionary. Their assistants sent polite messages. They were traveling, apparently, all of them, at once. She waited for the business partners who'd shaken her hand over billion-dollar deals and called her a friend. She got 2 text messages and a voicemail from someone's secretary. She waited for family. And the excuses came in gently, one after another, each one softer and emptier than the last. There was one moment that broke something loose in her. Lying in that bed, unable to sleep, Emma turned on the small television bolted to the wall. And there, on a business news segment, was one of her senior executives. A man she had personally promoted, personally mentored, personally made rich. He was being interviewed about the company's future, and he looked into the camera with a solemn face and said, "Emma is family to all of us. Our hearts are with her. She's in our thoughts every single day." Emma stared at the screen. Then she looked down at her phone, at the call she'd made to that very same man 2 hours earlier. The one he'd sent straight to voicemail. The one he never called back. And the silence in that hospital room, the real silence, the kind no flower arrangement can fill, became louder than any boardroom she had ever commanded. Louder than any applause she'd ever received. For the first time in 15 years, Emma Carter was completely, utterly alone. And she had built every wall of that loneliness with her own 2 hands. Lying there, day after day, with nothing but the beep of a monitor and the ache of her own ribs for company, Emma was forced to do the one thing she had spent her entire life avoiding. She had to think. She replayed the decisions. Hundreds of them. The people she'd cut, without a second thought, always in the name of efficiency, always for the good of the company. She saw their faces drift past her, one by one, like a slideshow of everyone she'd ever hurt to get where she was. And through all of them, one face kept coming back. One face wouldn't leave her alone. Marcus Bennett. She remembered the way he'd looked walking into that conference room. She remembered the exhaustion on his face that she'd read as carelessness. She remembered how quietly he'd accepted it. No yelling, no pleading, no defense. And now, lying in a bed she might not have been in if she'd ever once learned to slow down, she found herself wondering something that had never crossed her mind before. What if there had been a reason? What if she had thrown away a good man without ever bothering to ask him a single question? What kind of person does that make her? She didn't have long to sit with the question, because late that rainy afternoon, the door to her room opened. Emma didn't even look up at first. She assumed it was another nurse coming to check her vitals. She was tired. She was in pain. She was done being disappointed. But the footsteps stopped at the foot of her bed. And when she finally lifted her eyes, the breath caught in her throat. Standing there, in a delivery uniform, still damp from the rain, holding a plain brown paper bag in both hands, was Marcus Bennett. The man she had fired. The man whose life she had helped unravel. The man who had every earthly reason to want her exactly where she was, and every reason to never ever set foot in this room. And instead, here he was. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Emma opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she possibly say? Sorry? The word felt so small it was insulting. So she just stared at him, this quiet man in his wet uniform, and she waited. Marcus stepped forward, gently, and set the paper bag down on the tray table beside all the towering flower arrangements. And he began to unpack it, one item at a time. First, a container, still warm. "It's soup," he said softly. "Homemade, it's supposed to be good for healing." Then a small bag of fresh fruit, washed and cut, the way you'd prepare it for someone who couldn't do it themselves. And then, last of all, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. A hand-drawn get well card, covered edge to edge in bright, careful crayon. And Emma's eyes fell on the picture at the center of it. a big, wobbly, impossibly cheerful yellow sunflower. "My daughter made that," Marcus said, a small smile touching his tired eyes. "Amara. She's 8. When I told her I was coming to see someone who was hurt, she stopped me at the door. She said, 'Daddy, wait, everybody who's sick deserves a card.' So." He set it down gently against the water pitcher. "She wanted you to have a sunflower. She says they're the flower that always turns to face the light." Emma looked at that crayon sunflower for a long, long time. Longer than she'd looked at any of the expensive arrangements crowding her windowsill. The ones from people who couldn't be bothered to show up. And something inside her, something that had been frozen solid for 15 years, began, very slowly, to crack. She managed to find her voice, and it came out cracked and small. "Marcus, the soup. You didn't have to. Where did you even—" And Marcus went quiet for a second. He looked down at the warm container, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "It was my wife's recipe," he said. "Grace, she used to make it for me and Amara whenever one of us was sick. She passed 3 years ago." He paused. "I don't make it for just anybody, but when someone's hurting—" He shrugged, gently. "Grace wouldn't have cared who it was. She'd have made the soup. So I made the soup." And there it was. The truth of it, landing on Emma all at once, heavier than the wreckage that had put her in that bed. This man she had humiliated, whose insurance she had cost him, whose worst day she had broadcast to hundreds of people, had gone home and cooked her his dead wife's healing recipe. For her. Because his little girl believed that everyone who's hurting deserves kindness, even the person who hurt them. Emma Carter, the Iron CEO, the woman who hadn't shed a single tear in 15 years, felt something hot and unfamiliar sliding down her cheek. And she realized, with a kind of horror, that she was crying, and that she had absolutely no idea how to stop. But Marcus wouldn't stay long enough to see all of it. Because he had a grocery route to finish and an office building to clean before midnight. So he gathered up his empty bag, told her gently to eat while the soup was warm, and headed for the door. And what the nurse was about to tell Emma next, after Marcus was gone, would break her heart wide open in a way the accident never could. Marcus had been gone maybe 10 minutes when the nurse came in to check Emma's vitals. She was an older woman, kind-eyed. The kind of nurse who'd seen enough of hospitals to know the difference between the people who show up and the people who don't. She noticed Emma still holding the crayon sunflower against her chest, still wiping at her eyes, and she smiled a little as she adjusted the IV line. "That man's a good one," the nurse said gently. "You're lucky to have someone like that." Emma shook her head, her voice thick. "I'm not lucky. He doesn't owe me anything. If anything, I owe him. I fired him a week ago. I ruined his—" She couldn't finish. The nurse's hands went still. She looked at Emma for a long second, like she was recalculating something. And then she said the thing that shattered whatever was left of Emma's walls. "Well, I don't know anything about that, honey, but I can tell you this. That man's been here every single day." Emma froze. "What?" "Every day," the nurse repeated softly. "Since the morning after your accident. While you were still unconscious. He'd come in on his break, you could tell he'd rushed over, still in that uniform. And he'd stand right there at the foot of your bed and ask us how you were doing. Were your numbers stable? Were you in pain? And then he'd nod and thank us and go right back to work. Every day, for a week." She paused. "He made us promise not to tell you. Said he wasn't doing it to be seen. Said he just wanted to know you were still fighting." Emma stopped breathing. "Every day, while the executives sent flowers. While the board members traveled. While her own family found excuses. while the whole world she had built for herself left her to rot alone in a room. The one man she had thrown into the street had been standing quietly at the foot of her bed, on his lunch break, in a delivery uniform, praying for a woman who had never once shown him a moment of mercy, and he'd asked them not to tell her, because he didn't want anything for it. Not gratitude, not his job back, not even to be seen. He'd done it for the simplest, purest reason a person can do anything, because it was the right thing to do, and because a little girl named Amara believed that everyone who's hurting deserves kindness. Emma Carter put her face in her one good hand, and she wept, not the quiet, controlled tears from before. Real tears. The kind that come from a place a person has kept locked up for 15 years. She cried for Marcus. She cried for the man she'd fired without a question, and the little girl she'd never known about, and the wife named Grace, whose soup was going cold on the tray beside her. And she cried, most of all, for the person she had become, a woman so obsessed with success that she'd forgotten that the whole point of any of it was supposed to be people. She'd spent her life measuring everyone by what they produced. And in the end, when she had nothing left to give anyone, the only person who came was the one man who had never measured her by anything at all. Later that night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about a detail the nurse had mentioned in passing, that Marcus had seemed to already know the hospital, know the nurses, know his way around the pediatric wing. And a cold thought settled over her, and she pressed the call button and asked a question, and the answer nearly stopped her heart, because Marcus Bennett hadn't just been coming to that hospital for her. His daughter was there too. Amara. The 8-year-old with the sunflower and the crayons and the belief that everyone deserved kindness, she was a patient in that very same hospital, 3 floors up, waiting for a procedure that her father could no longer afford. Because a week ago, a woman named Emma Carter had fired him in front of hundreds of people, and taken his insurance, and taken the only door standing between his little girl and the thing that could make her well. Emma lay in the dark and understood, finally and completely, the full weight of what she had done. The man who had brought her soup, his wife's soup, while she healed, was the same man whose child she had endangered. And he had brought it anyway. He had forgiven her before she'd ever even thought to ask. She didn't sleep at all that night. But by morning, something in Emma Carter had changed. For the first time in her life, the Iron CEO had a purpose that had nothing to do with money. The next morning, before the doctors had even finished their rounds, Emma called her assistant to her bedside. The assistant arrived expecting the usual, a list of demands, a crisis to manage. Instead, she found her boss propped up in a hospital bed, pale and bruised, holding a child's crayon drawing, with a look on her face she had never seen before. "I need you to find Marcus Bennett," Emma said quietly. "Today, and I need you to do 3 things, and I need you to do them exactly the way I say." It took most of the day to track him down. He was 3 neighborhoods away, carrying groceries up a 4th-floor walk-up, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. When he finally made it back to the hospital that evening, still catching his breath, still in his uniform, he was braced for anything. He had no idea what the CEO who'd fired him could possibly want now. He walked into her room, and he found a different woman than the one he'd left the day before. The Emma Carter who had fired him had been all steel and ice, chin up, eyes cold, certain of everything. The woman in that bed now looked at him with something he'd never seen on her face before. It took him a moment to place it, because it was so out of character. It was humility. "Marcus," she said, and her voice broke on the single syllable of his name. "Please, sit down. There are things I have to say to you, and I need you to let me get through all of them." And so he sat. And Emma talked. She told him she knew about Amara. She told him she knew he'd come every day. She told him she knew about the soup, and whose recipe it was, and what it must have cost him to make it for her. And then she said the words that she had never once, in 15 years, said to another living soul. I was wrong. Not just about you, Marcus, about everything. I built a company that treated human beings like numbers on a spreadsheet, and I was proud of it. I told myself that was strength. I fired you without asking you a single question, and I told myself that was standards. Her voice shook. And then I got hurt, and every single person I built my life around vanished, and the only human being on this earth who came for me was the one I threw away. You could have let them pay you to destroy me. I know they offered. You said no. Why? Why would you do that, after what I did to you? And Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, because my daughter's watching how I live, and I'd rather she grow up poor and proud than rich and cruel. Grace and I promised each other we'd raise a kind kid. I'm not going to break that promise just because you broke my heart, Miss Carter, Emma cried again. And this time, Marcus reached over, and, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, he put his hand over hers. Now, here's where a lesser story would end. The CEO learns her lesson, sheds a tear, and the credits roll. But Emma Carter had never in her life done anything halfway. And she wasn't about to start with the most important thing she'd ever do. If you're still here with us, then you're part of this story now, whether you meant to be or not. So tap that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us down in the comments which moment hit you the hardest: the sunflower, the soup, or the empty chairs. This has been Dad Untold Chronicles, and we're not done yet. Because Emma's recovery took weeks. Long, painful weeks of physical therapy and quiet reflection in a life that had suddenly gone very still. And in those weeks, she made decisions, real ones, the kind you can't take back. The first thing she did before she ever left that hospital was the thing she'd told her assistant to arrange. Quietly, without her name on it. Without a single camera or press release or tax write-off. She paid for Amara's procedure. All of it. Every last dollar. And she made the hospital promise not to tell Marcus where the money had come from. She did it exactly the way he had done it for her. In secret. Asking for nothing. Because she had finally understood the thing Marcus had been trying to teach the world all along without ever saying a word. That real kindness doesn't need an audience. That the good you do in the dark, for people who can never repay you, is the only good that ever truly counts. But Marcus figured it out anyway, of course. The hospital never said a word. But a man knows. When his daughter's procedure was suddenly, impossibly covered, when the little girl who'd been fading came through it and started to bloom again, her cheeks filling back out, her laugh coming back, Marcus knew exactly who had done it. And the next time he visited Emma, he didn't say thank you. He just looked at her for a long moment and gave her a small nod. And she gave him one back. And somehow that meant more than any words either of them could have found. Amara recovered. Fully, a few weeks later, a small, healthy little girl with 2 neat braids marched into Emma Carter's hospital room, walked right up to the side of the bed, planted her hands on her hips, and looked up at the most powerful woman in the state with the fearless honesty only an 8-year-old can manage. "Are you the lady my daddy made the soup for?" Amara asked. Emma, caught completely off guard, could only nod. "Did you like the sunflower I drew you?" And Emma, billionaire, CEO, the Iron Woman who'd built an empire and terrified 1,000 employees, felt her throat tighten as she looked down at this small child. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she said. "I'm going to keep it forever." Amara considered that very seriously. Then she nodded, satisfied, and climbed right up onto the edge of the bed like they were old friends, and started telling Emma all about sunflowers, and how they always turn to face the sun, and how her mommy used to say that people should be like that too, always turning toward the light, even on the cloudy days. And Emma listened to every word, and understood, finally, exactly where Marcus Bennett had learned to be the man he was. When Emma finally returned to Carter Global, months later, walking a little slower than before, leaning on a cane she'd need for a while yet, the whole company held its breath. They expected the Iron CEO to come back sharper and colder than ever, to make up for lost time with a fresh round of firings. Instead, her very first act stunned every person in that building. She called Marcus Bennett back. Not to give him his old job. She offered him a new one, a position that hadn't existed before, one she created specifically for him. Director of Employee Relations. His entire job, from that day forward, would be to build the kind of company where no father would ever again have to choose between saving his child and keeping his paycheck. Where a person's worst day wouldn't be broadcast on a live stream. Where kindness was written into the policy, not just hoped for in the hallways. And Marcus took it. Not for himself. He could have found work anywhere by then. He took it because he realized he could spend the rest of his career making sure no other exhausted parent ever walked out of that building carrying a cardboard box the way he had. The changes came fast after that. Emergency family leave, paid, no questions asked. Flexible schedules for parents and caregivers. A hardship fund for employees hit by medical crises. Named, at Marcus's quiet insistence, the Grace Fund, after a woman most of them would never know. And a simple, unbreakable rule that Emma wrote into the company handbook herself in the very first line: before you judge a person's performance, ask about their life. You may not know what they're carrying. For the first time in the history of Carter Global, people didn't dread walking through the front doors. They smiled. They stayed, not because they were afraid to leave, but because they'd finally found somewhere worth staying. Turnover dropped. Loyalty soared. And here's the part the business magazines could never quite explain when they wrote their follow-up stories. The company didn't just survive its softer heart. It thrived. Productivity climbed higher than it ever had under the Iron CEO. Because it turns out, people will move mountains for a place that treats them like human beings. Emma Carter changed too, in ways that had nothing to do with the balance sheet. She started leaving the office in time for dinner. She started asking her employees about their kids, their parents, their lives, and actually listening to the answers. And every so often, someone would catch a glimpse of the framed drawing that hung on the wall of her office, right beside the awards and the magazine covers and all the trophies of a life spent chasing success. A child's crayon sunflower. The most valuable thing in the room. She used to say, in the years that followed, that the single greatest investment she ever made in her entire career wasn't a merger, or a market, or a stock that split 10 times over. It was learning, at 49 years old, from a single father in a delivery uniform, that a human being is never, ever expendable. And Marcus? Marcus kept writing in his journal every night. Letters to Grace, filling page after page, about Amara's recovery, about her first day back at school with her braids and her backpack, about the strange and beautiful turn their life had taken. And one night, years later, when Amara was old enough, he finally gave her that journal to read. Every entry, every letter. And she understood, in a way words could never have told her, exactly how loved she had always been. There's a lesson in all of this, and it's a simple one, but it's the kind we somehow have to keep learning over and over again. Titles fade. Emma had the biggest title in the state, and it couldn't fill a single chair in that hospital hallway. Money disappears, or at least it can't buy you the one thing you need when you're lying alone in the dark. Power comes, and power goes, and one wet night on a rainy highway it can all be taken from you in a matter of seconds. But kindness? Kindness compounds. A single father teaches his daughter that everyone who's hurting deserves a card. That daughter draws a sunflower. That sunflower cracks open the frozen heart of a woman who'd forgotten how to feel. And that woman goes on to change the lives of 1,000 employees and their families and their children for years and years to come. All because one man, on the worst week of his life, chose to be kind to the person who deserved it least. That's the thing about a compassionate heart. It doesn't just change the person who has it, it leaves a legacy that no amount of success could ever buy and no accident could ever take away. Marcus Bennett lost his job, his savings, and very nearly his home. And he never lost the one thing that mattered: who he was. And in the end, that turned out to be worth more than everything Emma Carter had spent 15 years building. So before you go, let me leave you with a question, and I really want you to answer it down in the comments. If you were in Marcus's shoes, fired, broke, humiliated in front of the whole world by the very person now lying helpless in a hospital bed, would you have walked through that door with a bag of soup? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? Be honest. There's no wrong answer. But your answer says a lot about the kind of person you are. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that there are still good people in this world, the quiet ones, the ones who show up when no one's watching, then do us a favor. Give it a like so more people find it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists. And subscribe to Dad Untold Chronicles, because we've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about ordinary fathers doing extraordinary things. Because in the end, the buildings crumble, the fortunes vanish, and the powerful are forgotten. But a father who chooses kindness over vengeance, love over bitterness, and his daughter's soul over his own comfort, that man leaves behind something the world can never take back. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth living for.